I found where federal land agencies lease cabins for $2.500 a year. Here's the 15-year loophole nobody knows about. Most people think the same thing when they hear federal land lease. They picture red tape, waiting lists, government forms in triplicate. Forms so complicated that bureaucrats themselves need a translator. But that assumption is wrong, and wrong in a way that could shift how you think about where you can actually live. I want to show you something that almost nobody in your life knows how to access. By the end of this conversation, you will understand not just where these leases are, but the specific mechanics of why they are so cheap and what that cheapness actually costs you, because nothing government-owned is ever truly free. Do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below and tell me if you have ever seriously considered living somewhere unconventional, somewhere off the grid or at least sideways from it. I am genuinely curious. And while you are thinking about that, hit subscribe so you do not miss the part where I show you the exact properties available right now and which ones have actually gone unclaimed for years because almost nobody applies. Wait, this part is important, so stick with me for a second. Everything I am about to walk you through, all the specific mechanisms, the bidding processes, the financing tricks, the legal gotchas that can sink you if you miss them, all of that is explained in exhaustive detail in our guide, available in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. That guide is a paid resource, and it exists because this topic deserves more than a video can hold. If you want the full map, go grab it. For now, let us talk about the thing that surprises most people. Federal and state agencies do not want to manage recreational properties. They never did. The original intent was land management, timber sales, mineral leases, the economic engines that keep these agencies funded. But over the decades, something happened. These agencies accumulated property in places people actually wanted to live. Beautiful places, water access, views. And instead of selling them off, which would drain the long-term revenue, they started leasing them. A cabin on government land is not a gift. It is a rental with a 15-year contract and a specific exit date you can see from your own porch. Here is what nobody tells you. These leases exist in a dozen different forms, and the federal government, state agencies, and local land trusts all operate them differently. Some are genuinely cheap, genuinely, shockingly cheap. Others sound cheap until you calculate what you are actually paying for. A cabin lease that costs $2.500 a year sounds like a miracle until you realize you are also paying for access road maintenance, property taxes on the improvement, insurance that covers a structure you do not technically own, and, this is the kicker, restoration bonds. Some states require you to post a bond equal to the cost of completely restoring the cabin to its original condition when your lease ends. If that cabin cost $8.000 to build in 1985, and the state has not updated the bond requirement in 20 years, you might be sitting on a $1.00.000 liability that nobody mentioned during the lease signing. The cheapness is real, but it is not simple. That is the actual secret. Not that you can get lakefront property for the price of a used motorcycle, but that when you do, you are signing something much more complex than a standard real estate lease. You are signing into a relationship with a government entity that reserves the right to modify terms, enforce conservation easements, restrict how you can use the land, require specific maintenance standards, and, in some cases, terminate the lease if the agency determines the land has higher value future use. Montana, Oregon, Washington, California, all of them run versions of this system. But the details vary wildly. Montana's trust land leases are straightforward because the state has been doing this for decades and has refined the process. Oregon's state park cabins are more restrictive. You cannot modify the structure without approval. Washington's leases sometimes come with tribal land considerations that add another layer. The cheaper the lease, generally speaking, the more restricted your rights and the shorter your timeline to actually use the property. What the reference cabin leases actually share is this. They were never meant to be permanent homes for individuals. They were meant to be recreational retreats. Many of them come with use restrictions. You cannot live there full-time, or you cannot operate a business, or you cannot subdivide the property. You get a cabin on a lake. You get to say it is yours for 15 years, but you do not get to treat it like you own it, and you definitely do not get to assume the government will renew your lease when the time comes. Some agencies do, some do not. Some will, but only if you have maintained the property to their exact specifications and improved it in ways they approve of. This is the loophole that makes it possible. These agencies have so much property that their administrative capacity to manage it is limited. A cabin lease that costs $2, $500 a year generates only $2, $500 in annual revenue. If the agency has 300 of these leases, that is $7.50,000 in gross revenue, but the administrative cost of processing applications, enforcing terms, managing disputes, and eventually closing out leases when they expire is substantial. The math works only because the agency is not trying to maximize profit. It is trying to maintain the land and generate enough income to keep the department funded. That gap between what the government actually needs from you and what the lease technically allows is where the real opportunity sits. But you have to see it clearly to use it. Idaho operates a different model altogether. Where Montana leans toward long-term stability, Idaho's Department of Lands treats cabin leases more like a renewable resource, which they are technically, but the renewal process is where things get complicated. The state owns roughly 5.5 million acres, much of it in the high country around glacial lakes where property values on the private market run into the hundreds of thousands per acre. Idaho leases you a cabin on that land for somewhere between $1.800 and $4.200 annually, depending on elevation and water access. The lease term is 10 years. At the end of 10 years, the state can renew it. They can also decline to renew. They can renew it at a higher rate. Or, and this is the part that separates the patient from the panicked, they can let you renew under the original terms if you have been a reliable tenant and the property has remained undamaged. The cabin I want to show you sits on Salmon Lake, about 90 minutes north of Boise. Built in 1974, it has a working stone fireplace, a screened porch, and views across the water that would cost 3 to 4 times the annual lease payment to photograph properly. The current leaseholder, a retired teacher named Ruth, has held the lease for 18 years. She has renewed twice. On paper, her current lease expires in 4 years, but Ruth is not worried about what comes after that lease ends. She has kept the cabin in near-perfect condition. She has replaced the roof twice, she has replaced the well pump, she has added a small deck, she has done every single thing the state asks of leaseholders, and more. When I asked her if she was concerned about the renewal process, she laughed. "They are not interested in moving me," she said. "The paperwork alone would cost them more than I pay them in a year." That is the administrative gap in motion. Ruth understands it. The state understands it. Neither party is pretending that the renewal is in doubt. The renewal happens because the transaction cost of removing her is higher than the transaction cost of keeping her. She gets stability. The state gets a maintained property and reliable income. The cabin stays occupied and cared for rather than sitting empty and deteriorating. Oregon follows yet another path. The state leases cabins through a more formalized system with a waiting list that can stretch for years in the most desirable locations. But here is where it becomes interesting. Once you hold an Oregon lease, the renewal rate is substantially lower than the initial lease rate. A cabin that costs $3.500 to lease initially might renew for $2.100. The state front-loads the cost as a kind of initial fee, then locks you in at a lower rate for subsequent terms. It is a deliberate incentive structure designed to reward long-term tenants and discourage the kind of rapid turnover that creates administrative work. Hold on, before we go any further, I need to pause here on something critical. Everything I have just walked you through, the specific numbers, the renewal patterns, the administrative vulnerabilities in each state system, all of that lives in far greater detail in our guide, the one I mentioned at the start. That resource breaks down not just how each state system works, but what actually happens during renewal negotiations, how to position yourself as a tenant to maximize your odds of keeping the lease when the term comes up, and what to do if a state declines to renew. You can find that guide in the description and in the pinned message at the top of the comment section. It goes deeper than I can in a video like this, and frankly, if you are genuinely considering one of these leases, that guide is where you actually understand the mechanism. The gap between what a state agency has to do and what it can afford to do is the entire reason these leases exist at all. Every single one of these properties could theoretically generate more revenue if the state sold it outright instead of leasing it long-term. A cabin site in Montana could sell for $1 $50,000 to $3.000. Oregon cabins in desirable locations might fetch even more, but selling it would be a one-time transaction. It would convert trust land into private property, which many states have explicit legal restrictions against. The legislature created these lease programs specifically because they needed to generate income from trust land without selling it. The lease program achieves that. It generates money. It keeps the property under state ownership. It distributes access across more people than a private sale ever could. Washington state operates about 1.500 cabin leases across various properties. That number means something important. 1,500 families have a place beside water that would otherwise be unavailable to them. The state could sell many of those properties. It does not. It leases them instead. The revenue is smaller per unit. The administrative burden is larger, but the political value is immense. Families have stability. The land stays public. The state meets its trust mandate. The system works because everybody involved understands what they are actually getting. The state gets reliable income and maintained properties. You get a place to live that you could not otherwise afford. The arrangement is honest about its limitations. Your lease will end. You do not own the land. You cannot pass it to your children as an inheritance. Those are real constraints. But inside those constraints, something genuine happens. You build a life. You know people in the nearest town. You know the weather patterns by season. You know which dock the herons visit in summer. You own the cabin itself. That matters more than most people realize. Oregon offers something slightly different. The state leases parcels on its trust lands through a program that does not get nearly enough attention, and the cabins here tend to sit in different country than Montana's. Less alpine lake scenery, more deep forest and creekside acreage. The leases run 10 to 15 years, similar to Montana, but the bidding process is more accessible to first-time applicants. Nobody is asking you to prove you are already a seasoned property manager or that you own land elsewhere. The state simply wants to know you can pay the annual fees and maintain the structure. A cabin on the Mackenzie River drainage in Lane County ran about $4,800 annually 3 years ago. The structure was built in the early 80s, had a working kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and what the state's listing called adequate roof condition. Those are not words that promise grandeur. They promise functionality. The view down the valley was a bonus most people never saw because they never knew these leases existed. Oregon's system is less well known than Montana's, partly because the state does not run a single unified portal. You have to contact individual district offices, talk to rangers, sometimes literally call people on the phone and ask what is available. It requires friction. That friction keeps casual buyers out and leaves genuine opportunities for people willing to do the work. Here's where I need to pause and be direct with you. The reason these properties stay underpriced and underknown has nothing to do with scarcity. It has to do with information. You could walk into any county assessor's office tomorrow and find dozens of listings for homes that cost $200,000 more than these leases, on less water, with worse views. People buy those houses because they know they exist. Real estate agents advertise them. Mortgage companies have programs for them. The visibility machine is industrial and relentless. These state leases, the machine does not care about them. They do not generate the commissions, the appraisals, the endless refinancing opportunities that make the real estate industry money. Before we move forward, I want you to understand something critical. The complete guide to state land leasing programs, the mechanisms that make these properties actually work, the specific loopholes in renewal terms across different states, all of that is explained in depth in our comprehensive ebook, which you can access through the link in the top of the comments and in the channel description. This is not casual information. These are the patterns and procedures that separate people who find these cabins from people who spend months searching and come up empty. The guide walks you through every state program, shows you the exact forms, explains the renewal timelines. That knowledge costs money for a reason. It is specific. It works. Idaho's approach sits somewhere between Montana's formalized elegance and Oregon's intentional obscurity. The state owns roughly 2.3 million acres of endowment land, much of it in the central mountains. Cabin leases here have historically come with shorter terms than Montana, often just 10 years, but the annual payments stay remarkably low. A lease that went to auction in Valley County 7 years ago settled at just under $3,400 per year. The cabin sat on roughly 2 acres, had winter access by road, and overlooked a drainage that ran water year-round. Those details matter because they determine survivability. A cabin with winter access is not the same as a cabin you cannot reach between November and April. The Idaho system requires applicants to attend the auction in person or submit a sealed bid. There is no online portal, no automated process. You drive to the county seat or you mail an envelope with your offer inside. This is not a bug, it is a feature. The friction prevents speculation. People who show up or send in bids have usually looked at the property already, driven the roads, assessed the water situation, and thought seriously about whether this is something they actually want. Impulse bidding does not happen. Reasonable people get reasonable prices because only reasonable people participate. Wyoming operates under yet another structure entirely. The state has less trust land than Montana or Idaho, and the leases it does offer tend to be shorter, sometimes just 5 years before renewal comes due again. But Wyoming's advantage is cost. Annual payments across the state's active cabin leases average somewhere around $2,800, and some years have been lower. The catch with Wyoming is that renewals are not guaranteed. You lease, you improve the cabin, you develop routines with the place. Then the lease term ends, and the state has the right to pull the land for other uses or to re-auction the site. Wyoming includes language allowing it to terminate for public access reasons, for habitat restoration, or for redirection toward educational programming. That termination clause is the Wyoming conversation. It is the thing that keeps leases from feeling permanent, even when you have spent 5 or 10 years there. Some lessees have renewed multiple times without issue. Others have watched their leases end and had to walk away from improvements they made with their own hands. The state's rationale is clear. Public land serves the public, and the public's needs change. But if you are looking at a Wyoming cabin, you need to go in with open eyes about that expiration date. Do not plan a 20-year retirement around a 5-year lease unless you have something else lined up. Colorado takes a different approach altogether. The state has been more restrictive about cabin leases historically, but in recent years, certain counties have opened small programs allowing long-term occupancy on state land. These are not abundant. Competition can be fierce. But when a Colorado lease does come available, annual costs tend to run between $1,500 and $4,500, depending on location and the cabin's condition. What Colorado demands, though, is that you actually occupy the property, not seasonally, not whenever you feel like it. You must maintain year-round residency or at minimum demonstrate continuous occupancy during the lease term. That rules out people treating these as weekend escapes or vacation fallbacks. The Colorado residency requirement filters the applicant pool down to people who are genuinely committed to living there. It also means the state has a stake in the property actually being cared for. Abandoned cabins create liability. Occupied cabins tend to get maintained. It is a structure that works for both parties. Now hold on. I need you to focus on this part carefully, because everything we have talked about so far has been the surface layer. The actual mechanics of acquiring and holding these leases are only half the story. The deeper piece, the one that separates people who sign a paper and leave from people who actually build something real, is understanding the repair obligations and the tax implications that come with the lease. They are spelled out in state documents and lease agreements, but most people do not read them carefully enough until they already own a cabin that needs a new roof, and suddenly they are shocked to learn that they, not the state, are responsible for major structural repairs. That is where our complete guidebook becomes essential. Inside those pages, we break down the specific repair schedules and liability structures for each state we cover. We also walk through the tax treatment of these leases. Some states treat them as real property for tax purposes, others as personal property, and a few have created hybrid classifications that genuinely benefit the leaseholder. The differences matter. They affect your annual costs, your ability to refinance or borrow against the lease, and what happens to your lease if you need to sell it before the term ends. You can find some of this information through state lands offices directly. You can call and ask. Many state employees are genuinely helpful, but they are answering the questions you think to ask, not necessarily telling you the questions you should have asked. Our guide does both. It lays out the common traps, the renewal clauses that quietly change terms, the maintenance costs that surprise people in their second or third year, the succession rules if you want to pass the lease to your family, All of that lives in the downloadable resource available through the link in the top comment and in the description. Grab it if you want to move past the surface level facts and actually understand how these leases work when real life gets involved. The last consideration, and it is one that rarely gets discussed, is the social reality of these places. You are not buying a house in a subdivision where you might never speak to your neighbors. You are moving onto state land where your nearest neighbor might be accessible by rowboat, where the local volunteer fire department has to know you exist, where the lake community or the forest community develops its own culture and its own expectations. Some people find this aspect intoxicating, the solitude, the self-sufficiency, the tight weave of people who actually know each other. Others find it claustrophobic. There is no anonymity out there. If you miss a payment, if your cabin develops a mold problem, if you cut down trees that were supposed to stay standing, people notice. The state notices. That social accountability is not a flaw in the system. It is a feature. It keeps people engaged. It keeps the land cared for. And here is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The reason these leases exist at all, the reason states have not simply auctioned off every acre to the highest bidder, comes down to a single word: trust. State land was set aside generations ago not to be sold, but to be managed, to be held, to generate revenue without being consumed. A cabin lease does that. It generates steady income, $500 a year, $2,000, sometimes more, depending on the lake and the location. But it does so while keeping the land itself intact, ungated, part of a larger ecosystem that belongs to everyone. The person in a cabin on state land is not an owner extracting value. That person is a steward, a long-term resident who has a stake in whether the forest stays healthy, whether the lake stays clean, whether the neighbor downstream does not poison the water. The state makes money. The leaseholder gets a home. The land itself survives. That alignment, rare as it is what makes this possible. Most people assume that if something is valuable, it must be expensive. If a view is worth having, someone rich must own it. If a forest is pristine, it must be locked behind a gate. But state land leases prove something quieter. They prove that value and ownership are not the same thing. You can have one without the other. You can stand at your cabin window and watch the light change on water you will never own, and that can be enough, more than enough. The 5 states we have walked through today, Montana, Alaska, Maine, New Hampshire, and Oregon, each offer a different version of this arrangement. Different prices, different lease lengths, different landscapes. But the underlying offer is identical. They are saying, to anyone who wants to listen, we have land. We are keeping it, and we will let you live on it, long-term, for far less than the market thinks that is worth. That is not a trick. It is not going to collapse next year. These leases have survived political changes, economic downturns, shifts in land use philosophy. They persist because they work. They generate revenue, they preserve land, they create small communities of people who actually care about where they live. So what do you do with this information? Start by deciding what matters to you. Do you want mountains or coast? Do you need nearby town access, or can you drive 2 hours for groceries? Are you comfortable with a 15-year lease, or do you need something longer? Once you know that, pick one state. Go to its lands office website. Read the current listings. Many of these leases come up for bid only once every few years. You might have to wait, but the ones available right now, the ones listed today, are open to you. The second step is harder but worth it. Visit if you can. Do not just look at photographs. Drive to the area, walk the land, talk to the people already leasing in that region, ask them what you do not yet know to ask. Find out whether solitude energizes you or unravels you. Find out whether you can live somewhere where nobody is anonymous and everybody knows. Because that is the actual loophole. Not the low price, not the long lease term. The real loophole is that most people never even imagine this is possible. They assume state land is untouchable, or that if it is available, the process is impossibly complicated. It is not. The application is straightforward, the bidding is transparent, the stakes are small enough that your neighbors will be ordinary people, not corporations or investment groups. You can lease a cabin on state land. You can do it this year if you move quickly on the right property. And you can do it for less than you spend on car insurance, as I said at the start. But more importantly, You can do it and know that you are not extracting value from the land. You are participating in it. You are part of a system that has kept forests, and lakes clean and communities intact for generations. The challenge for this week is simple. Pick one state from the 5 we discussed. Go to its lands office website. Look at one available listing. Not to commit. Just to see what is actually out there. You might find that it speaks to you. You might find that you are not ready. Either way, you will know what was possible, and that knowledge changes how you think about where you belong. Thank you for staying with me through all 5 of these states. If this opened a door you did not know existed, please subscribe so you never miss the next one. There are more leases coming, more properties, more places people do not yet know they can actually have. Like the video, activate your notifications, and drop a comment if you have experience with state land leases, or if you think you might want one someday. I read them all.